Well, Alpesh B.Patel, CEO of Prifinium Partners, is here with us to go through the papers. Morning, Alpesh.
Morning.
Starting with the Spanish Daily. And obviously this paper has been published before we got news of the deal, the rare agreement coming out of Brussels overnight, that they've agreed to one supervisory body for Eurozone banks. Is that going to help Mr. Mariano Rajoy, who's on the front page of El País?
That's not really the big story for Europe, in the sense that, yes, I agree, the papers are carrying and things, but obviously what's really important for Europe is, can they keep the cost of borrowing by the governments down, in other words, bond yields down. And I was having lunch with the chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management yesterday, Jim O'Neill, who his view is that the big turning point over the summer was when Mario Draghi said, we'll do whatever it takes to keep those bond yields down, which has meant that banks such as Goldman Sachs have actually, to some extent, got off the backs of trying to probe and trying to make those bond yields rise and play with the markets, because that's a lot of firepower when Draghi says we'll do whatever it takes.
Absolutely, but in part, and look, correct me if I'm wrong, in part to this whole banking proposal is to avoid, for Spain, to avoid another island. And I think for people who don't follow this kind of thing, we should remind them, the Irish property bubble burst. The banks went bust. The Irish government bailed out the Irish banks. That left the government with not much money left. The government then had to get a bailout from the Eurozone. This is to avoid all that, because the worry is Spain's banks are going to need a bailout.
They're definitely going to need it. The important thing is they're going to get it. And so the market's already looking 2 steps ahead. And what the Europeans have done this time, the people in European finance have done this time, is they've stayed 1 step ahead of the news curve, ahead of the journalists. So before the nasty stories can hit the press that, oh, they're not going to agree, this is not going to happen, they're looking ahead and coming to those agreements, making those statements well in advance, so it kills the negative press.
But it's how they get the money, right? You say they're going to definitely get, and we know that, yeah. It's how it's not going to go to the government like it's done in the past with all these measures. It'll go to the banks under this proposal. That's what.
Well, the most important thing is that they're going to get it. The tweaking of the details of where it will go, whether it will go to the banks, whether the European Central Bank will end up buying the debts of the banks directly, or give it to the state government, give it to the Spanish government, or whatever. Those mechanisms aren't really important. What's really important is it's going to be made available, and those are the statements, and people are keeping in line with that. On the whole, people are keeping in line with that, and that's what's changed since, say, 6 months ago, when we kept on having these panics that, will they be able to finance it? Will they be able to finance it? If you look at the news stories, they've moved on to that. Exactly.
Yeah,
they've moved on to the story about things which are not affecting the crisis directly, such as banking regulation. It's a great red herring, and the politicians are 1 step ahead of the journalists, I'm afraid.
Okay, let's be careful there. No, let's talk. You mentioned the word crisis. Kind of a bit of a crisis for poor old Google yesterday. Its results were supposed to be released after the bell, the closing bell on Wall Street. They were released while the bell was, while the markets are still operating, 3.5 hours early.
Yes.
How?
Yeah, exactly. How does that happen?
Somebody's not so good with the internet, I think. They probably need advice on how to use a keyboard. It was a major problem for them, because when you release your earnings ahead of time, such as that, what tends to happen is exactly what happened here. Their share price dropped 10%. They had to suspend the stock on NASDAQ. Now, I did an analysis at 5 a.m. local time this morning, a discount cash flow analysis, because that's what geeks like me do at 5 a.m. And when I did it on Facebook for the BBC, I said Facebook's share price will drop 50%, and it did. Now, I used the same calculation for Google, which is currently trading at $700. And my analysis shows that it should be around $1,000. I'm not a shareholder in Google, so if I remain as accurate as I was with Facebook, then I expect this is actually a good opportunity to buy. Like I said, the share price fell off a cliff because of this. It's actually good news for people who are looking for a bit of a ride up from 700 to 1,000.
But more generally, there is a problem, isn't it, with the so-called glamour stocks? Generally, I mean, you mentioned Facebook.
There's a problem with Facebook because they still haven't cracked how to generate revenue. Google is not in that camp, and the reason for that is they are generating revenues. They've had a bit of a problem here, which is the slight blip when you look at the trend. But they're in a very different camp. They have managed to crack how to generate revenues from just otherwise being just a search engine. Facebook is still, and I'm an addict, is still it's a nice little thing for me to play around with, and I thank Mark for it.
Moving on to the International Herald Tribune, and a reminder of that shifting demographic in the United States. And we're not just talking about an immigrant population, we're talking about homegrown Latinos being wooed by both candidates.
Yes, the story here is the amount of spending on the Spanish channels, the Spanish channels in the US to try and get the Latino vote. Actually, another very geeky thing I've done is I've looked at the last 5 general elections for every single state and seen which way they go, Republican or Democrat, and given the current polling results, which way they're likely to vote, and done that on a weighted average basis, with the nearest general election being the most important. Ohio is the key, not the Latino vote. And if you look at Ohio and the way the candidates are, it's pretty neck and neck. So when the election happens in about 3 weeks, that's what you want to watch. It's the Florida of 2000.
Right. Okay.
Don't let me get too geeky,
but all eyes on Ohio.
Ohio,
you're saying,
not the Latino
the November
vote.
election. Okay.
They're not going to be able to swing it enough. It's Ohio, and in actual fact, President Obama is having a big rally there with former President Clinton, who's been on fire during this campaign.
It sure has. Okay, shall we move on? What is this? This is in the Guardian, the Nokia story. Actually, I was on air all day and broke these numbers. We weren't expecting anything great from Nokia. I mean, they've blown about $1 billion in cash or something like that, but over the last 3 months. But, you know, I was talking to a telecoms expert and going, you know, Nokia is putting all hopes, so much hopes, on, a few new handsets, the Lumia model handset. That's not going to turn its misfortunes around, is it?
You know, the big problem, in 2007, a company called Apple released something called the iPhone, and since then, Nokia's share price has dropped 90%. Isn't it worrying that no matter how big a giant of a company you can be, somebody comes along, invents something, and within 5 years, your share price is down 90%. You've blown, like you said, 600 million euro in 3 months. They've only got 3.5 billion euro left in cash reserves. But that's not the problem. It's not the fact that they've blown a third of their cash reserves or thereabouts. The bigger problem is, what's the game plan? What's the turnaround? What are they going to make? This is a phone which uses Windows. iPhone's just killing everybody in the markets, and the real battle now is between Apple and Samsung, not just in the courts with intellectual property, but in terms of market share. And so, you know, Nokia, great company, but no longer.
No, absolutely.
We're running out of time, so we've got to be quite quick. The Independent first, an exclusive, and something quite revolutionary. It could change the way we live.
Yes, the story of fresh air into petrol. Carbon is the key here as the fuel. This is what I do for the government, for UK Trade and Investment, their Global Entrepreneur Programme. We look for technologies like this from around the world to bring them to the United Kingdom. I'm delighted we've got a good news story on the front page of Science and Technology, British Science and Technology, and I say this is exactly what we're trying to do, get more of these companies into the UK and revolutionise some of our clean tech and energy problems, and there are more and more of these coming up all the time, and it's fantastic news, obviously, for the environment. It's great news for these kinds of scientists.
A cracking story. I don't know, we have only got about 15 seconds. 6 years. Would you wait 6 years to collect $5 million?
6 seconds, my friend.
Me too.
It is. Sorry, was that too short an answer?
No, that was a very short answer, but no, that's an interesting story. They didn't want any negative influence by winning that money.
Alpesh,
anyway.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks,
Alpesh B.Patel,
We'll
going through the papers. And thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks a lot. See you soon.